Welcome all. Today I'd like to talk about a subject that I'm pretty sure that most videographers are well aware of, and that's camera sliders. I'm fairly certain that most would have either used them, owned them, and certainly are well aware what they are and what they do. And I thought I'd give my experiences on owning several sliders, because there's often not a lot of feedback in the long term from reviewers and so forth as to how they really perform, and are they actually as useful and versatile as often intimated. Like many, my first venture into sliders was a fairly long one, 120 centimetre or 4 foot carbon fibre slider made by Selens. It wasn't motorised. I motorised it later on because I found that it's virtually impossible to get really consistent sliding action with it because of the length and the way that it works. But with the motorisation on it, it actually works quite well. It's a little bit of a cumbersome motorised setup, no apps or anything like that to control it, but sometimes simple is better. And it turned out to be a reasonably useful slider, but not as useful as I thought. 120 centimetres I found was way too long. It was cumbersome to take along anywhere with me, especially on my trips bush where I wanted to use it because of its size. You could only really use it on a tabletop like shown here. If you wanted to put it onto a elevated position, you needed 2 tripods or stands to keep it off the ground and support it at both ends. And so the long term, I ended up using it less and less, and in fact virtually not at all. So it was quite frustrating from that point of view. So I started looking for a different slider, and rather than go anything horrendously expensive, I ended up buying a fairly cheap slider, which is basically one of these, which I'm sure that a lot of people have seen all over the place. It's very similar to the Edelkrone, which gets recommended on videos all the time, but probably about 10 times cheaper. And it's actually quite well made. It's not a bad slider in itself. Unfortunately, shortly after I bought it and used it a few times, one of the internal wheels developed some sort of a default fault in it, and as you slide it along, it would just sort of bump each time, and you'd have probably about 4 or 5 bumps from one end to the other on length of movement, and it was really frustrating because you couldn't avoid getting a bit of a shudder in the camera every time it did that. I pulled it apart several times, and there is nothing that I can find internally that's causing it. I've looked at all the wheels and everything else, and so it became a bit of a disappointment and frustration to try to use, and therefore it ended up not being used at all. So it's one of those sort of sliders that I definitely wouldn't recommend because of the way it's generally designed. I don't know if the Edelkrone is significantly better. I'm pretty sure that the mechanisms is much the same. Might be better tolerances, but in the long run, I'm not really particularly a fan of this sort of slider. So I started looking around for something different in the small size, and by happenstance came across a couple of videos that recommended a slider that I haven't seen before, and I think it only came out fairly recently. And from the videos, it really looked impressive, and I happened to find a very good bargain on eBay, so I took a punt and ended up buying it. And that slider is a brand name called Zeapon or Zeapon, depending how you want to pronounce it, and it's called the Micro 2, and it's really a fantastic little slider. It's extremely well made. For a small slider like this, it feels chunky, solid, and it just feels like a very, very finely tuned instrument. And when I say finely tuned instrument, it's the mechanism and how it operates that makes it so unique. It has fluid dampening in the pulley wheels, and so when you actually move it, the movement is extremely smooth. You actually have to experience it to understand how smooth it is. It's amazing, and I've never sort of encountered anything like that before. It's my view, it's even better than a motorised slider. Now Zeapon apparently is looking at making a motor drive for it with an app and all that sort of stuff, but even without that, this thing actually performs brilliantly. I'm absolutely totally stonked and surprised at how well it performs. Now it also came with an accessory, and in most cases this is sold as a separate unit. I believe that some places it does come, like with my eBay purchase, it came with it, and it's a very, very good concept, but poorly executed. The idea is that it has a plate that attaches to the base of the slider, and unlike most sliders like the cheap one that I just showed you and the Edelchrones and that, when you place it on a tabletop it only goes to its 30cm movement. You can't actually do the full double movement that it normally does. But this plate is designed to attach and lift the thing off the ground, and that means that you can actually get the full movement, and with the legs that come out it will have an ability to at least balance a relatively lighter camera, as it wouldn't balance the 9 kilo camera of mine. But the idea is good, but where it fails is that the little legs that come down to support it on the tabletop don't have any sort of locking mechanism, and so what happens is on a smooth table they just tend to open up, and the whole thing just doesn't collapse, but you might as well call it collapsing. It's just not ideal. And because they are so short, it is only good for tabletop. If they'd made them longer, and there is actually quite a bit of room to make them almost as long as the main legs, you could have used them outside as an elevated platform, loaded ground shots with a better little foot mechanism on it. Now the other problem that I found with this slider as well is that it has a bottom plate, which I think the intent is that you can mount it sort of more or less permanently onto a ball head, and it comes with what looks like an Arca Swiss plate, but it's not Arca Swiss compatible, that is, and so it just doesn't work. Now if they'd made that Arca Swiss compatible, you could have actually mounted that plate onto the bottom of the slider and then used it at any time to mount to a camera tripod, and then with the longer legs you could have actually used that upside down and it would have worked perfectly. There would have been no reason why you couldn't do that, but the way it's designed at the moment, I would not recommend anyone buying this. If it comes in a kit and you get it at the right price, okay, get it, but don't go out of your way to buy this thing. It just won't work for you very well at all. So what I did was I put an Arca Swiss plate on the bottom of the this slider, and that allows me to put it on the tripod, and I could make up a more heavy duty plate for ground mounting and whatever else. I've also got an Arca Swiss plate on the top and a fluid head that allows me to move this thing around, so I can actually position the camera into different positions, and it performs extremely well. It's just a superb slider. I mean, for a hand moved slider, I don't think there's anything on the market that equates to this. There may be, but I haven't seen it yet. So what I did was make a short video that I'll show now. I won't say which slider took it. I used both the 120 and the Zeapon with the Blackmagic Pocket 4K rig, and just did a short video that will demonstrate how the sliders work. I won't say which slider did which part, but after the video I'll let you know which one was which. So have a look at that and take a guess and see if you can get it right. Okay, that's the video. Now for your information, the first scene was shot with the 120cm slider, and the second one was done with the Zeapon. And from my observation, I think the Zeapon one actually looks more pleasant. The movement distance kind of looks the same for both of them. They're both fairly good. I'd be happy to use either one of them, but it is absolutely surprising how good the Zeapon is mounted to a tripod, whereas the 120 was on the ground, and you get such a smooth movement out of it. So if you're in the market for a slider, certainly the longer or even the shorter carbon fibre ones aren't too bad and worth considering. I wouldn't consider the cheap Edelchrone style sliders at all. I think that's sort of it'll be a bit of a hit or miss as to how good the thing will be. But the Zeapon, absolutely, I would totally recommend it to anyone who's interested in getting a high quality slider, and one that just gives you virtually treacle smooth movement on any camera, up to 8 kilos rated weighting, and it'll easily handle 9 kilos as I showed. So that's my views on sliders. I hope it gives you some information, and see you next time. Cheers.